Ideation Summit that we'll be holding. We're officially live on Facebook and now we're recording as well. So just so everyone knows, uh, yes, now we're streaming live on Facebook. So first of all, let me welcome everyone who's attending here. And this is a conversation that needs to be had. A little before we start with the discussion, let me quickly introduce the GPODS Ideation International Summit. The whole point of GPODS, the Global Policy Diplomacy Sustainability Fellowship, is while also to provide 3 months of intensive training and education in one of the in three of the most important tracks that we consider extremely important for development of youth and mid-career professionals going forward, which are international relations, sustainability, and public policy. A very important thing that we pride ourselves on is the ability of our fellows to think out of the box, to discuss ideas which seemingly have no solutions or have obvious solutions that are not explored enough. And the whole idea of and the whole idea of this International Ideation Summit is to ideate on some of the issues. As you'll see, we are holding panel discussions on issues like polarization and regionalization. We're talking of pandemic and the wildlife. We're talking of pathways to public participation, the future of waste, and where do we head towards a circular economy. And we're talking about space, laws, issues, policy, diplomacy, and this run for the moon and Mars that is happening around the globe. So this is our effort to talk about all of these pertinent issues. And we start with the first panel discussion, which is on polarization, regionalization, and the ultimate test for the global world order. Now, it becomes extremely important to discuss this in light of the global politics that have been taking place for almost half a decade. As if nationalization wasn't already on the rise, regionalization wasn't already on the rise, self-dependence and independence wasn't already on the rise. COVID struck the planet, and there were metaphorical fences created around the boundaries of each of our countries. So to discuss this, we have GPODS fellows who would be talking about the issue. Let me quickly start by introducing them. We have Malika Sinha, who's a GPODS fellow. We have Maushmi Mehta. We have Sahid Yunisa. We have Srija Kundu. We have Shashank Shukla, and we have Sneha Yadav in the alphabetical order, as you might notice. And we'll just open it up for discussion. A couple of rules that we have for the panel discussion. The chat box would be open for the last half an hour of discussion. So you can note down all of your questions and put it across in the chat box once it's open. As I said, this is live on Facebook, and this is also going to be recorded and put up on the official website of GPODS. Links to our social media handles and other important links will be circulated by the host in the chat box till the conversation continues, until we open it up for the rest of the audience members to help us ideate as well. So that being said, I welcome all of you, and I welcome most importantly our GPODS fellows. And the discussion, and with the discussion, the International Ideation Summit version 1 is now open. So let's get into the topic right away. Polarization, regionalization, and the ultimate test for the global world order. What does this mean? We have, as I touched upon this, we've been observing a trend of these strongmen leaders, these nationalistic leaders who really value their national identity. And before we get into the whole concept of what is polarization, let me move to Shashank to start with. For his ideas on what has been happening and how this is not a specifically COVID-driven instance, and it could have been observed even before the pandemic struck us.
So thank you, Ishan. Actually, that's a very good note on which to start off this particular discussion. Because yes, while we can say that the COVID-19 pandemic has basically highlighted some of the fault lines that exist in the global world order, but I believe that the origin of these fault lines lies much before the pandemic. Why do I say so? Now, if you see, if we move from the eastern part of the world, right, or the global south, if you will, and move towards, right, the western part, you see a certain trend. Now, if the audience could kind of imagine the world map in their heads, and we start from, say, Russia, right, from Putin in Russia, then Xi in China. Then, if you, till very recently, President Abe of Prime Minister Abe, sorry, of Japan, right, also was a nationalistic leader. Then, going forward, right, we also have people of a very interesting case, if you kind of think about it, of Myanmar, where somebody, right, coming from a human rights background, Aung San Suu Kyi, under her leadership, there was the current polity in Myanmar is deeply divided, and she is turning out to be more and more nationalistic. Then, of course, we have India. Going forward, we have, even in Europe, we have Turkey, we have Iran, we have the Brexit man, Boris Johnson, and then going up till very recently, President Trump. So there is a broad string of nationalistic, strong arm, I dare say, xenophobic leaders who have deeply divided within their own country. It's not just that the fault lines lie in the global world order. Within the polity in their own countries also, there has been a deeply divisive politics, right, that each of these strongmen represent. So that is, I think, an interesting trend that we kind of need to explore. That is the fault lines that have been almost a manifestation of the fault lines that existed within the polities of their own nations, where they need to be aggressive, they need to be ultra nationalistic, and the global world order has become a zero sum game, kind of. And whenever such a scenario existed, the multilateralism and the global world order as we knew it has taken a backstage. The COVID pandemic has, just as I used the word, highlighted the same. But the origins of Putin, of Xi, right, of many of these other leaders lies much before the pandemic. So that I think, right, sets the stage for what we can kind of discuss further.
I
If
think
any
that's
of
a
my colleagues.
yeah, that's a very interesting point, Shashank. And if I may have the liberty to, let me also point out to the list of leaders and countries that you already mentioned, Israel and Netanyahu and
How can I forget? Yeah.
Saudi Arabia. These are some of the other nations that have strongmen leaders, and some might argue that they've been there for longer than one would like. But before we get into the whole, and I think that sets the base really well, as Shashank mentioned, let us also understand what polarization really is. And are there textures and layers to polarization that we do not perceive right on the face of a discussion? And I'd invite Moshmi to come in here and probably just shed some light on what her views might be on the concept of polarization and the topic generally.
Thanks, Ishan. Hi, everyone. I'm a lawyer by profession, but I'm deeply interested in social psychology. So that's why I want to shift the focus today to the reason why the masses today are so polarized and how we got here. Because we are so locked into our political identities that there is virtually no candidate, information, or condition that can force us to change our minds. Because we collapse systemic problems into personalized narratives. And when we do that, we cloud our understanding of politics and confuse our theories of repair. And in this book titled Why We Are Polarized, this American journalist Ezra Klein, he explains it very beautifully. He says that there are two types of polarization. There's issue-based polarization, and then there's identity-based polarization. And the problematic one that has given rise to this discussion today is identity-based polarization. what it means is that our partisan identities have merged with our racial, religious, cultural, ideological, and even geographical identities. So the crisis is not that we have partisan identities, because we've always had those. The crisis emerges when partisan identities fall into alignment with our other social identities. Very interesting example of how identity polarization in the masses is being used by corporations. In fact, is these two American corporations, Whole Foods and Cracker Barrel. They track deep partisan divisions to set up their stores in the right locations. So Whole Foods, for example, is a grocer catering to those high in openness to experience and change, so more on the liberal side, whereas Cracker Barrel is aimed at those preferring traditions. So these large corporations with skilled teams that carefully choose the placements of new location, they base it on the target audience polarized identity, so to speak of. But I also want to highlight that this need for identity is not something that we can get rid of, right? Because that's how we bridge our differences and even more so our mutual likeness. For example, if you're a 90s kid or I'm a 90s kid, then the best decade for music was the 90s. So coming to why our identities, if at all we don't have mutual likes, it can really deepen the differences when we distance ourselves in that manner. And why is it so difficult to talk about politics with our family members and friends? I think this is one of those reasons. I would like to continue on this a little further, actually, if it's okay.
Yeah, please go ahead, Moshmi. But while you do, let me also specify for our and remind all of our audience members that we'd be opening the chat box in the last half an hour. So I request you all to note down any points that you might have to contribute to the discussion. Yes, Moshmi, please go ahead.
Yeah, and we're basically in a vicious cycle, right? Because political parties are formed to calm our divisions and not represent them, but that is what works for them now. For example, the Brexit story, it was not about imposing liberal democracy on Britain, but it's interesting because if you look at the country before the Brexit vote, all the polling that was done up to 2016, you did not see a deep divide amongst the masses. I mean, there were small fractions on both sides, yes, but there was not a lot of anger about Europe. It didn't consume the whole society. But the referendum and complicated politics that followed have made it that. So it's yet another example of how polarization has become a political tool to be used by a group of people. Boris Johnson himself was not known as a polarizing leader when he was the mayor of London, but he started to become one recently to keep the party in power. And I think that is the key issue, because when we participate in politics to solve a problem, we are participating transactionally, and that is okay. But when we participate to express who we are, that's a signal that politics has become about identity. And that is when our relationship to each other and politics changes.
I think that's a really good point. And I think what also underlines your point, Moshmi, is that through the Brexit example and otherwise, you've established that polarization, it has come to a point where it has kind of turned itself into this vicious cycle where polarization is breeding more polarization. And to Shashank's point, it is evident that it's happening globally, but when you look internally, it's happening in pockets and circuits within each nation as well. Now, again, that's a very interesting point, and maybe it's pertinent to delve into the fiscal and economic repercussions of something like this, and what are the kind of eventualities that we look at. Again, before we get into how this affects institutions internationally and nationally, I think it'll be, unless there's a market to such a thing, unless there's a demand and supply for such a thing, it would not be possible to deliver it at such a scale. So, Srija, I come to you with that issue and question as to what might be the economic and fiscal repercussions, consequences, causation of this regionalization and polarization that we talk of.
Right. Thanks, Ishan. for bringing up the nexus beautifully between polarization and identity conflict, and and how it could sort of have economic ramifications, if I meant to say. And I think my fellow panelists like beautifully sort of elucidated on how this identity divide, or this need for identity politics, is actually solidifying or reshaping a lot of our priorities, which could be both on the national front as well as on the international front. So I think to Shashank's point, which you mentioned, right, that origin was not, it's not something which is a phenomenon of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it had its origins way back in times. And I would actually bring your attention to the post-Bretton Woods liberalization model, right? And this is this continued conquest, or this need to have this economic integration or cooperation. And so it's actually this regionalism, right, in terms of when you're bridging those economic pacts or agreements, they always have, any form of, I think, politically, diplomatically, nations can have a lot more macro perspective. But when it comes to forging economic alliances, you automatically have the nation's self-interest, because it's not just related to maintaining or forging those traditions, but also getting your own market demands and supply met. So in that sense, economic pacts are not necessarily not necessarily, I would say it's more confined to what the nation's priorities are. I think in terms of regional trade agreements, we've already seen the NAFTA, with the Mercosur, the preference. So all of these preferential agreements, tariff, lowering the cost of tariff,
Hi, Srija, I think we're having some issues with your connectivity, but point well taken. And I'd invite the others to build upon this point that uh, the financial resources per se, we've been seeing how these indicators that used to be the major indicators of the success of a nation, for example, the GDP of a nation or the GNP for a nation, or its standing in a particular trade, standing of strength in a particular trade treaty, used to be the pointers to how strong a country is. But we've been seeing that as maybe because of the COVID as an excuse, the GDP and GNP are not the sole priority anymore. And this also kind of leads to the whole discussion on international politics as to how, as long as you have your vote bank supplied, as long as you're right enough or left enough, you'll have the votes anyway, and the other factors do not count as much. So I'll open it up to all of the fellows who might have any comment on this, and just have a discussion on this issue. Srija, you're back, I see.
It's like, yeah, can
Yes,
I go ahead? I'm sorry, because of
I'm just trying to
the
sum
patchy internet.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Right. I just did not realize I was having an unstable connection. So yeah, so the point, what I wanted to make is, so in terms of regionalism, it's been a phenomena since the beginning, and I think the 2008, the crisis which happened, it started out, I think, is a model for how regionalism is kind of having its foothold, because what started out as basically a subprime mortgage case, like translated into one of the severe financial crisis that that kind of led to like that led to actually erosion of commercial banks, insurance companies, and that had serious financial and monetary repercussions. And that tells you the fragility, or the instability of the international financial institutions we have. And I think that is the ticking or the melting point, where people actually started doubting the efficiency and the process flow of these multilateral institutions. How well are they equipped to actually deliver on those crises, or on those the problems that we have? A lot of these, and a critical IPE, like international political economy, for reference, actually takes into concern that whether regionalism is actually like an offshoot or a necessity offshoot of globalization, or is this a way forward? So I think with this point, I would like to again, and I've already mentioned like how the weakening of this multilateral institutions has already been happening. And I think more than political or diplomatic issues, I think economic crises are present that cauldron, where those very, but the power of these institutions are tested. So I think, well, regionalism as, and given the RCEP negotiation that we recently concluded, like we had different, I mean, there have been like different components as to why India, but then definitely we can discuss about it, like why India chose not to kind of put its foot inside the RCEP agreement. But again, it's this, and so my broader point being that this theory or this entire concept of regional integration has always been there, in terms of countries, like-minded countries coming together to forge those preferential trade agreements, to get those specific access to markets, get those specific FDI policies, get those, have those competitive advantages which you wouldn't have. Like for instance, and us having a trade in the ASEAN region would give us more preferential market access as compared to having some sort of a trade agreement with countries from the LSC, which is the Latin American region, right? So I think these are very different dynamics we have to consider in this perspective. And of course, COVID-19 pandemic, the entire need for having the shorter, resilient, agile supply chains, brings into for the question if is regionalism is a way forward, at least in economic, trade or economic and trade policies.
I think a couple of very, very important points there. Thanks, Shrija. You've spoken about how international institutions have do not have the kind of trust you might want to repose in them. You've also spoken about whether regionalization is the way forward, and that's the new world order we're looking at, despite the political change in the US, which is something that we must address. You've also talked about looking inward and how we need to look within India and within Nigeria and Ethiopia and US and Europe, and how these countries will cope individually, especially because of the trust deficit that we see happening around the globe. But before you came back in, I think Shashank had a point to make. Shashank, I'd invite you to.
So, Ishan, I would like to kind of again build on what my colleague Shrija was mentioning. See, I think this whole point of this COVID pandemic, right, being touted as the reason for these fault lines needs to be challenged, right? And I want to take a couple of minutes to take us back in time, right, where we need to understand that political context, right, of a particular time, they shape the economic realities, right? And I repeat that political context shape the economic realities. And let's see, post World War, right? There was this huge, the world had suffered a huge war, right? Economies the world over had suffered, and there was a big distrust, right, of the capability of nation states to kind of go ahead, right, and foster economic activity without getting into conflict and destroying everything. That is where the Bretton Woods institutions were established, and the so-called, there was the need felt, right, of kind of a impartial global world order overseen by these institutions, right, to kind of play a level playing field. So that was the first phase, right? Then that was meaning the whole world was supposed to be governed by these Bretton Woods institutions. Then when the Cold War happened, that is the first time when you see, right, that it was a bipolar world, right, in the 70s, in the 80s, right? And then the first kind of institutions, right, where we had NATO, right, if we look at that as an institution, and Warsaw, right, which were primarily security based, but they also underpinned the economic aspects, right, of the member countries of these two set of institutions. Then we move on to the next phase, right, where it got fragmented even further, right? You had the EU coming in, you had the emergence of ASEAN, right? You had the SCO, right? So different, even SARC, right? These smaller, right? Meaning if you see the trajectory, right, there's even smaller groupings that came together because countries felt the need, right, to kind of trade and build better regional and security arrangements in their neighborhoods. Now, as the populism, right, is rising, that has given rise to leaders, right, the strong arm leaders, the 10, 12 leaders that we said, and maybe we've forgotten a few, right? Now, there is the great need as economy the world over stutters, growth falls. There is this need to go ahead and concentrate on that it's me and for myself. Now, this has given rise to strong arm leaders, and this has dealt a body blow, right, to the concept of the multipolar, multilateral global world order. So, I wanted to highlight this trend, right, to kind of break the narrative. I was reading a report from ORF, right, which again talks, there is a report from UNCTAD, right, which talks about COVID being the driving force for these fault lines. I very respectfully disagree. So just to build on Shija's point.
I right. Ishan, can I?
Yes, please, Shrija. I just wanted to highlight something
Right.
before you go ahead, and I know that Saheed has a point to make as well before we go on to him. But it's a
Okay, sure.
very, very interesting point that Shashank has brought out, and to be absolutely honest, I haven't really thought about this. But just think about when Shashank took us through the history of these international institutions and the underpinnings of trust in these international institutions. The first thing to notice is that they came about these international institutions as a response to a global crisis. In that case, that was the world wars. And today, hardly it could be challenged that we're not facing a global crisis in terms of the COVID pandemic that we're facing, and we are almost counterintuitively working towards the antithesis of that global world order of coming together of through international institutions, these nations who want to have some semblance of economic stability, financial stability, trade stability, outflow and inflow cash stability. So it's a very interesting point that Shashank makes, and maybe we could build upon that. But Srija, to your point first.
Yeah. So my point is, Shashank, can I just go in right there and just give you like one sentence
Yeah.
which suggests that, you know, regionalism and globalization, which is a byproduct of this international global order that we know, these multilateral institutions are not antithetical concepts.
Yeah.
They are, I would say, more like a derivative. I
Yeah.
mean, regionalism, as I've already mentioned previously, that it is probably a natural offshoot. So when you kind of elicited us beautifully about the different, the normative formations of these institutions which came into being, right, is part of the greater discourse of why we need like a, like a bipolar or like a multipolar world order, and why these institutions were being brought about. But they have been tested time and time, right? And now it's, I think, one of the reasons why the Trump administration, and this is where I know where kind of sort of try to defend or sort of try to understand the policy. Of course, that's a different discussion we can have. But I think one of the reasons why the Trump administration wants to, or rather disregards this various negotiations, be the TPP or the various agreements that it has with this country, is that it wants to reduce the structural trade deficit which the US economy faces. And I think that tells you that the countries, when an economic diplomacy, again, I would say it's more transactional if you compare with the other political and the diplomatic forms of engagements a company has. The Quad is a perfect example of why, it's a body which has been just brought about having countries with like-minded, shared culture, shared perception, shared similarity coming together to counter China, if we can just put it out there. But it never, but it's still a body in the making. But when you talk in terms of this economic arrangements, they always are looked at from a one perspective. They're always looked at like, if you're giving me enough, if you what are the trade-offs, and what are the pros that I'm having when I make a specific arrangement with you. And I think this is where the Indian example of RCEP coming brought about. India as a market was asked to open up 74% of its products to the countries within the RCEP, whereas Indonesia, I'm just giving an example. Indonesia wanted to just open up 50% of its market. So the disparity that you see, right? And of course, there are different angles to why India chose to withdraw from the RCEP negotiation. But what I wanted to just point out is, when underpinning all these economic arrangements is again bringing or coming yourself, or just taking a step back and bringing the nation first approach, rather than just having an overarching view, but which basically underpins this institutions. And then again, so this is like like a chicken and egg problem, I would say.
Point taken, Srijit. I think that's a very important point. We also kind of summarized it earlier as well. I think it has been happening, and it's important that we notice it. But before we delve any deeper into that issue, I know that Sahid has a couple of comments before we move on to Sneha. So Sahid, feel free to jump in at any point.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to make some comments regarding what Shank said, what Moshme said, and also follow with what she just said. I would like to see polarization as kind of opposite to globalization. If we looked at the fact that economic activities is actually being globalized, trade is actually being globalized, but why is it that we do not see politics being globalized? Is because interest becoming differs almost every decade. When we look at the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union was also out of space. Russia was unable to keep up with the power struggle, and the United States actually took over the power struggle. And during that, the occupation of the United States has actually imposed a whole lot of changes into so many countries democratically. In fact, preaching about freedoms so many countries, and through that, people are losing their culture, their religion, and they're losing their identity. And that actually comes to the fact of the motion talking about the identity. And people are losing identity of this sort, and it's like they are trying to domesticate other people's culture. And through this, so many countries have actually tried to uplift regionalization, and that is very much contrary to African case. In the case of ECOWAS, in the case of African Union, you have identity. Lot of developed, let's say, a developed country like the United States comes with democratic hegemony and towards the country politics, eradicating other kind of monarchical systems, and of course, they try as much as possible doing that using the military power, doing that using the economic power. But one other thing is that how do we get all these countries along, which has to do with their legitimacy? Though they create a branch of the World Bank to bring about this legitimacy kind of economic impact, but it wasn't enough because of the conditionality that comes with out of the World Bank. So in this kind of a case, we see that brings to the issue that Shrija actually discussed about in terms of economic disparity. The conditionality that's being used by the World Bank that comes with some of their loans, some grants, actually forced a lot of countries to borrow more, the politicians to be able to use some of this money and not be accountable. And when you talk about some of the initiatives like the Structural Adjustment Program, the SAP, which actually destroyed the economy of Nigeria as of today. It happens a days ago, and it was imposed by the World Bank. So some of this initiative to deregulate the economy of some countries has actually forced the country.
If you could elaborate on the SAP that you mentioned for the audiences.
Yeah, the Structural Adjustment Program is all about devaluation of the currency. It's to employ more imports than exports. So because as at then, the currency of Nigeria was very, very equivalent to dollar. And now the regulating makes force the Nigerian government to, because they are borrowing some money, to actually devalue the currency, allow for more import of some products, and that actually destroy a whole of the local industry. So the SAP is actually a very, very good initiative to tell you that the developing countries have little faith in, or brought the result of developing country having little faith in developed country. And as a result of that, there came in this African Development Bank, and so many other countries are actually developing or their own kind of a region, but regional bodies, and also national bodies came into being, because the developed countries, some politicians actually, the populists are actually coming more spring up and to say, oh, why don't we, rather than governing, showing more of this power might, why don't we just stay alone and maintain our stability, and let's see whether the developing country will be able to cope. So there's this kind of disparity in terms of politics that is actually going on contemporarily now, and that is where the nationalists are actually coming in with the right of Trump and say, okay, we don't want to do much more for people. And he said that during the NATO convention, where he was trying to force the German chancellor to pay much more money, contributes much more money to NATO stability in terms of funding than they've been doing, because US have actually been sponsoring a lot of the funding. So this actually comes from this perspective. And I would say, in a nutshell, that regionalization was due to the fact that primarily people are losing their culture, people are losing their religion, and people are also losing their identity. And because legitimate issue comes into full, the countries that are actually leading have failed to carry other people along, even with the supranational institution like the United Nations. United Nations actually borrowed this power from its member state. So it lies to what the member state also say. Even NATO also lies with what its member states say. And sometimes they also put up a proposition that member states can actually go against. So I think it's actually based on those facts. Thank you.
I think that's a few brilliant points made there, Sahid, and really adds dimension to the debate, because one corollary to the points that you've made is how you've kind of redefined regionalization. When you think of regionalization, you think of an identity of belonging to a region and identifying with that region per se. But you have also extended the definition of regionalization to imposing your identity on other states. For example, what has happened in Africa. And that also kind of begs the question that a lot of eyebrows are raised today when China gives off loans in return of certain institutions that it eventually buys off in that transaction in Africa or in Middle East and Western Asia. While this was already happening by the US, by maybe the UK and EU, through these legitimate institutions of World Bank, IMF, which are majorly funded by some of these Western powers. So maybe we also need to check the legitimacy of what has been happening under the garb of providing funding, when you're only putting institutional constraints on governments, ideological constraints on governments where these fundings are actually taking place. So a couple of very interesting points. Sneha, unless you have a point to make right now, I'll move on to Shashank, who has something to say.
Sure, you can move to Shashank. I can add later.
Okay.
Ishan, meaning just hearing my colleagues, right, bring out those very pertinent points. I just want to string together a thought that that has been in my mind, and which I kind of just hearing Shrija, right, that we are kind of and what Saeed said, that we should not look at, right, globalization and regionalization. It is as kind of antithetical to each other. It is almost like a continuum, right? And linking that to what I said when we began the discussion, right, that political context shape economic systems, right? If you see, right, again, right, what began initially, right, as institutions giving birth, coming into existence due to distrust, moved to when the political context became security, right? Security of their own blocks, right? Then that gave rise to different set of economic and institutional structures. When economics actually started taking, I'm talking about, if you meaning keep in mind the flow that I said in the beginning, right? World institutions Then coming to Warsaw and NATO, when security was the dominant political theme of the time. Then when we talk about these various trade-based institutions like EU, SCO, we are talking about ASEAN, then economics took over, right, as the predominant thinking. And this is where I want to segue into what Moshmi said in the beginning. Now is the time when in the recent past, right, identity has been taking over, okay? And that might be, right, the key driving force, right, for driving more and more polarized politics at every level, right, within countries, right, and between countries, right? So we moved from trust to security to economics to now identity being the primary politics within countries and among countries. And that is playing out in the global politics. That kind of just struck my thought, and I thought that this needs to be kind of brought out in our discussion. And what do you think? So meaning this just...
Shashank, I could not have put it any better. And over the past two times that you've spoken now, every time you've traced a history. Earlier, it was the political history and that of the international institutions. And now you're talking about the ideological history of what underpins all of these conversations that are happening globally. And at some point, I'd also want to deep dive into this whole point of unipolarity and bipolarity that we've touched upon during our discussion. But let's move to Sneha, who's been waiting with a point for some time, and then Moshmi, if she has anything to add.
Sure. I just wanted to add, the crucial role of state behaviors here, where I feel that a regionalization does not come about unless and until the states in a particular region again want it. So it may come more through a more or less spontaneous or unintended convergence in terms of political regime, economic policy, or security. But often it can be identified as a triggering political event, which again sets the process in motion. And just in contradistinction to other policy takers or the small players, in order to understand regionalization, I also feel that we can divide the policymakers into the world powers, where we may not be able to achieve hegemony on the world level, which, since the range of their influence is undefined and varying, meaning there is again a certain competition among them, then hegemony among the regional powers in their own regions, or which are simply dominant, which may be looked upon like they are with suspicion and fear among the minor players. So what I also feel is that in some cases regionalism grows from extended bilateral relations. For instance, in the Americas, where both NAFTA and Mercosur resulted from a situation where third parties became anxious not to be left in the cold, which was Canada and Uruguay. The regional powers in these cases, the USA and Brazil, usually prefer bilateralism to regionalism, which is again also in the case of South Asia, where the small players softly imposed regionalism on the regional powers. And India, I again feel, has always been more in favor of bilateralism, where the same behavior seems to be repeated by China in the Eastern Asia. So thus, I feel that the change from the bilateralism to regionalism is thus also one crucial indicator of increasing regionness of a region, and how it has resulted from overlapping bilateral agreements within a region, since they also imply policy convergences in various fields. And what I actually wanted to discuss here is the concerns of regionalizations in terms of security and development. What are first the security problems to which regionalization may provide a solution, where it can be summarized in the metaphor of black holes, or what in UN terminology is referred to as failed states, and the national disintegration, where it seems to reinforce the process of regionalization via threats to regional security, provoking some kind of reaction on the regional level. So just a part of this, where even the unilateral can either be carried out by concerned neighbors trying to avoid a wave of refugees, and in the bilateral cases where there's some kind of agreement between the intervener and the country and where the intervention is made. So just a couple of points that I had there.
I think really well made too, Sneha. Both the whole understanding of regionalization versus bilateralism, or multilateralism, if it's a tripartite agreement, has been really well drawn out. In fact, one of the things that I was trying to think of when you were talking about the whole concept of regionalization and getting together of certain countries. I think Shrija already mentioned about Quad and how Australia, Japan, I think India and South Korea, if I'm not wrong, the four have come together. What was the fourth country, Shrija? You might correct me. You'll have to unmute yourself.
It's Japan, Australia,
India and US.
India and US, correct.
India, and US.
Yeah, so those four have come together, and so my point is that maybe identity is no longer just an ideological identity. Maybe identity is also derived from the commonality of a local threat or a regional threat, because of which we can have institutions coming together, being framed to, while ideologically diverse, like what we're seeing with what's happening in the Middle East now, with new alliances being framed, which are ideologically completely diagonally opposite, but there is a commonality of threat that they want to challenge. And maybe regionalization also comes from this threat perception, and legitimate or otherwise, but threat perception. And a very extended version of this threat perception could also be the new age colonialization of a certain country, where you want to impose your perception of threat onto that country. So you'd move into Africa just to challenge the investments that China is making, and try and have your ideological foothold as against that of China. So these are some of the interesting predicaments that the world order is trying to comprehend. Moshmi, do you have anything to say there, or I'd move to Sahid and then introduce a new a topic to our discussion?
I was just thinking about the way forward from here, where Shashank dropped off. So we know that identity is now the challenge, right? So the way forward is not a linear route, because nobody has concrete solutions, because at any given point of time, there are a lot of facts out there and a lot of smart people offering them to you in different configurations. In fact, the more the voter has information, the often better he or she is able to bolster her identities with rational sounding reasons. But it is not possible to be rational all by yourself, because rationality inherently is a group project. But I can build on that later after you introduce.
I think that's a brilliant point. That's actually a very, very good point to the idea of rationality, because we haven't really gone into the rationality of globalization, regionalization, polarization. So, open, I think Shrija and Shashank, both of you had something to say there. Shrija, do you want to go?
Yeah, so I think not on rationality. So I just wanted to sort of, when Masumi mentioned the way forward, right? So I just wanted to, before we dabble on solutions, I think that there's a need for us to understand the reconfiguration of the world order. So when you talk about these new concepts, these are not old, these are not new, right? These are like predated concepts, but these are like new wave of globalization, new wave of regionalization. So it's like, is it globalization 2.0? Is it like regionalism, like, new wave of regionalism as opposed to old regionalism? So I think because of the restructuring or the refocus of both markets and companies and economies and the political scenario as a whole is perceiving the world as to be in. I think all of these equations that we see, which have been more traditional in a sense, it's getting reconfigured, or it's getting like reconfirmed, so as to say. And getting to your point about rationality, I think, Ishan, we've always had this classical theory in international relations, right, where you have like a zero sum approach, or you have like a the egg and chicken problem, as I mentioned, or you have some of these very specific problems, or some of this the game theory is one instance where the rationalism in international relations plays out. So I think when you talk about the rationale of something, it always and again, there's a very resurgence of as identity politics, or as the entire discourse of strong men making a mark. It's again this resurgence of national level or domestic priorities taking actually a front foot, as opposed to as opposed to international or more broad macro sort of priorities. I think there's been a sort of a shift, like an inward shift to reorient your strategies, align to the needs of your domestic market as opposed to an international market on that front.
I think
So yeah.
that's again a very interesting point, and when we talk of international politics, as our audiences would know, there's a thin line between the game theory being employed in practice and ideation on regional strategies being employed in practice, and the other extreme, which is the Stanford prison experiment, where the facade of authority lets one control the behavior of the other. So we have to be very careful when we discuss the world order going forward. But we have to address the elephant in the room when we're discussing regionalization, polarization. And with Biden coming to power, there's a lot to be discussed on the implications it might have for the world order. And I know that Shashank was referring to Biden's speech earlier, where Biden has now famously said, "America is back."
Yeah.
And the consequences of that. And I know that Saeed is cooped up in a corner of America, so he'd also want to jump in on what it holds for the future of America per se, and the global politics as well. But going to Shashank on this issue first, because Shashank found it to be fascinating, the implications of America is back as against, juxtaposed to Make America Great Again, I suppose.
Lovely. I will segue into that. Just one thing, what she just said piqued my interest, right? She was talking about new regionalism, right? Now, new regionalism as an IR concept in itself, right? Kind of took root around the 2000s, if I'm not wrong, the beginning 2000s, and as Stiglitz, right, remarked that basically, when there is this tussle between this so-called self-reliance, right, and the nation emergence of the nation state versus forces, and this will segue beautifully into America is back, and the forces of globalization, if you will, then actually regionalization might be a balancing idea. So I want to put that thought process in that between the forces of globalization on one hand and emergence of the hegemonic nation state, right, on the other, regionalism might be a balance that the world may arrive at. Okay, so again, right, looking from a macro perspective, and this is where America is back, right, is very relevant to us, because I was watching his victory speech, and when he said that, I was actually thrilled, because what is happening, what is gonna play out, right, is that during the presidential years of Donald Trump, the whole idea of the globalization side of the narrative, free markets, globalization, democracy, right, kind of retreated, and apart, and kind of there were good reasons for that, right? The space was left was occupied by China, right? China, with its policies, financial policies that were invasive to a certain extent, as my colleague Saeed was saying, a very heavy identity-based politics, as my colleague Mosi was saying. Now, with the counter narrative again coming back, right? I want to kind of throw it out there that I posit that maybe the narrative around the free market, democracy, and all that will make a comeback, right? And will be a counterweight to the currently all pervasive kind of almost hegemonic, uh, uh, meaning flow of Chinese money, influence, right, the world over. So how this will play out and where the balance will kind of rest. Will it rest in regionalization? Will one side or one narrative prevail over the other? That is something that maybe we want to discuss as a group here, because I find that very fascinating.
I think that's a brilliant point, Shashank. I could see some audience members clapping when he made that point, so it's also very well made. But if I have to play devil's advocate before I go to Saeed and the rest of our panel members, I would also, I can think of a situation, even though I would be hard pressed not to demolish the absolutely optimistic point that you have taken there. with the rise of democracy and other Bretton Woods institutions. But there is a thought that because now America would heed back to its place in the global politics that it used to hold, say, 10 years back, China might want to double up on its divisive regionalistic politics and just pour in more and more money in these developing nations, in this is soft diplomacy that it is undertaking uh, through the Belt and Road Initiative and all of these other institutions that it's building up. And this might actually backfire for the regional politics and global politics going forward, because China might just become even more aggressive going forward. So that's a thought that we could discuss. But I would open it up for the other members before we move on to anyone who wants to chime in. Sahid, do you have a view there on the implications of Biden coming through? Let me first make a very quick announcement. Aditi, you could open up the chat box and we could let the audience members throw in any questions that they might have for us, specifically to any of our panel members, because some of us have been optimistic, some of us have been controversial, some of us might have been too philosophically analytical. So if you have any direct questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Sorry about that, Sahid. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to talk about some few things. One about it is that when we look at polarization and regionalization, polarization actually spoils regionalization. And what leaders are actually not too comfortable with the concept of regionalization, to say, because that's how they brought about the issue of G8 and G20, which of course talking about putting about the economic prosperity, because they intend to spread prosperity economically, which is actually very inundated. And regionalization is trying to bring about strengthening the region's economic prosperity. But what they do is that to create an hegemony in every region. Let's take, for instance, hegemony with Saudi Arabia, hegemony with South Africa, hegemony with China, with India, China. So this is actually to cause conflict in the region and to exploit the region resources the more. I would say with this, the occupation of the word power is still something we need to really, really discuss. And it puts polarization and regionalization at opposite end, in my own opinion. Because with polarization, you have regionalization, and with regionalization, they're still creating some submates, some constituents of what would I say, some colonies of economic power, like the G20 and the G8, and the G20 and the G8, which of course helps to determine the economic prosperity of each and every region of the world. So with coming back to the issue of the United States, I think saying that the United States is back, it's something one would think twice, but it's something that is also very good. It's a very good sign, because when we look at the leadership position, when we look at the leadership position back home, it's much more shallow. I think there's now more polarized world than ever. But we think that the polarity can actually be more shrunken with the Biden dispensation. Having spent a lot of his years in the political arena, I think he knows what it takes to actually bring back the United States back and to compete with China, to compete with the likes of Iran as well, who happens to have lost a lot of opportunity to negotiate and become more stable internally. And when we look at their history of United States in some countries, I think it could be more strengthened with the likes of Iran.
All right.
Saeed, Ishan, just one, I can't resist myself. Saeed, now, and what Ishan said, right? That this whole thing, right? That some of us are optimistic. Saeed was beautifully diplomatic, right? It can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, right? What I want to kind of and Saeed, particularly throwing this ball back to you, that regionalization, right? Why are we looking at regions only in terms of, right, geography, right? Like Quad is as dispersed, right, as it can be in every sense of the word, right? Except probably for a shared underpinning of democracy, that narrative, if you will, right? So my thought process is that with these two competing forces, and I completely agree with you when Ishan, you say that China will double down, right? But don't you see that leading to, again, going back to the concept that when there are two competing forces, right, one is completely dominating one hierarchical world order, other a globalized world order, regionalization could be a compromise, and regionalization not only in terms of geography, but in terms of the groupings like G20, right? That is also a sort of a economic regional grouping, right? Versus Quad, which might be a security regional grouping, right? So and Shrija mentioned, right, that economics is becoming, the economic activity is also becoming very fragmented, right? It is becoming insular. So in a particular geography, maybe economic regional grouping. So not only geographical, many types, cultural regional grouping like SARC, right? So do you see that playing out with America is back?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Ishan, for bringing out that. There are several, I agree with you that there are several groupings. However, I wanted to look at the fact that the state is the most important unit of defining factor in international relations, international diplomacy. And national interest is so very, very important. So when we look at the groupings are actually majorly based, that is actually in compliance with today now view of diplomacy to say is that national interest and allied member states. You could see United States was able to thrive in becoming the world power because they have alliances. So these alliances is actually very much important, irrespective of the grouping. We have the G20, we have the G8, but they all have alliances, individual alliances that might not even be part of the G8. So in this kind of a case, regionalization plays a very significant aspect. Because I was checking through the website and I saw American Development Bank. Who are those? People that have access to this bank are those from the Americans, the Jamaicans, the Honduras. So it's more or less like geography plays a significant role and a defining factors when we talk about being polarized. Like for instance, now China being polarized, China is already competing with India and the likes in its region, and in fact wanted to create a colony in Africa, and the colony is actually very much competitive because their previous colonial nations, they're actually trying to ensure that their colonies are doing well, and they are competing with China on that road, and China is still having a very tug of war to do that. So I felt there are several groupings, and this diversification of groupings are actually things that are enabling the world leader to exploit them in terms of information, in terms of technology, in terms of resources. But geographically, people feel they are much safer with their countrymen than with their country nations than having somebody from another region. And that's exactly why we have the African Development Bank. We have so many of them. Irrespective of whatever alliances South Africa can create with the United States, it still prefers to be with Nigeria. When they were having this xenophobia, they were able to resolve because they have antecedent of cooperation rather than having the US out to intervene into this. So regionalization plays a very significant factor, despite other kind of classification.
I think brilliantly raised we have been redefining a lot of the concepts here in this discussion from redefining polarization, as Moshmi put, to regionalization, as Srija mentioned, and Sneha also touched upon, to now redefining maybe colonialization, the 21st century colonialization, which isn't as much as it used to be in the times of Normandy and India and 19th century colonization, but maybe just the colonization through debt that Saheed is probably touching upon. Now, I know that Saheed mentioned Jamaica, and Jonathan is kind of itching to come into the discussion. But before I do that, I'd also want to touch upon, and we've been getting questions in the chat box as well. I'd want to touch upon one thing that we wanted in our pre-discussion to discuss at some length, which is the weakening of institutions globally and nationally. And when I say institutions, I mean the executive judiciaries around the globe. In the US, for example, you can see how divided the Supreme Court is, and it's becoming more and more divisive with every appointment now. In India, institutions are weakening. The media has taken another role altogether, where it's not just reporting, but creating emotions through its reporting. So there's a lot to be discussed when it comes to weakening of institutions. And I'd like to go to Moshmi because she had raised this point in one of our pre-discussions on how media and generally the institutions are sort of going downhill, if one would.
Thanks, Ishan. It's really interesting to see the role of media, especially because in today's world, we think they are the bad guys, but coming down to the grassroots level, again, speaking on behalf of the masses, it's really difficult for us to get out of that echo chamber. And, people think there's a straightforward solution there that you cross the information aisle, the liberals follow more of conservative content and vice versa. But interestingly, a social study has been conducted where 1,000 Twitter users were paid to follow a bot retweeting the opposite party content. And surprisingly, they did not like it, not surprisingly at all. I mean, they rather rebut the content and not actually reflect on the identity. So I think it's very interesting to see, even though the institutions are weakening in front of our eyes, but what are we doing about it? And Obama actually argued that polarized media tended to balkanize us into our political identities. He said during one of his speeches, so my advice to the future president is increasingly try to bypass the traditional venues that create divisions and try to find the new venues within which this new media that are quirkier and less predictable are found. I think Obama was offering the right explanation for polarization, but maybe from the wrong angle. He is right that it's all about which identities get activated and that our political identities are more polarized than our other identities. But he was, I think, way too optimistic in believing that our non-political identities could become our political identities, that we were somehow a truer reflection, that is somehow a truer reflection of ourselves. So I think in practice, our political identities are actually polarizing our other identities. But not to stray too off topic to somebody else who wants to talk about the judiciary aspect.
Yeah, again, very interesting point into the whole, maybe the axiological points of polarization and identity politics and how institutions, including the media, might be, it might be expected of them because it all boils down to readers and consumers and whoever is reading more. If it's a headline with an exclamation mark, that's more attractive than a headline with a full stop. So that kind of is almost intuitive. So any comments on the weakening of institutions, if any of our panelists have? Otherwise, we have a couple of very good questions in the chat box, and I know that John has a question for us as well. So some few comments, if anyone might have.
So, Ishan, right, now the one thing that I would like to add is the weakening of institutions is a phenomenon, right, as Mosmi was talking about, has been felt, right, at the international level, as well as various national levels, right. So we need to see that the institutions, right, the institutional mechanisms, right, have kind of taken a step back. That is also a trend, right? And media is just one manifestation of that, where media also, right, has taken on a certain flavor, right, of the debate that we have been having for the past discussion, rather, that we've been having for the past 1 hour, where media also, right, is very nationalistic sometimes, right, and very contrarian, right, and very argumentative, right, whereas earlier that might not, where that was not the case. Not just media, but other institutions, both nationally, internationally. Countries are withdrawing from it. US being a classic example, having withdrawn from institutions, or lessened its engagement with institutions like WHO, ILO, WTO, and whatnot, right? And this is also something which, and this is where I want to kind of make a significant point here, that it's not like why I keep harping on the US part of it, because earlier when countries like India and China, right, used to kind of say that, okay, boss, we will not, we kind of, I shouldn't say undermine the institutions, but actually had a grievance, right, that the Western world had their time in the sunlight, right, now it's our time and we are being denied and all that. The trend now is that the Western powers, especially when the US withdraws from the institutions, right, that in itself helps establish, then there is a problem, right? And in the Trump years, that is what happened, and that has led to these institutions suffering a body blow, right? Both in terms of credibility, right? Because what was underpinning them has kind of taken a backseat. So that is one thing that I want to bring out in our discussion.
That's
Just
actually very
to
interesting. Moshmi, okay, go ahead, please.
sorry, just to finish what Shashank was saying, it's and to be a little constructive about my problems, I was going to offer two solutions. Maybe one could be that we draw out our attention from nationalized politics, because you know spraying over attention over Trump's last tweet is, by the way, which is what he wants us to do. Uh, Takes away the attention from focusing on our local or state politics, because um, essentially, I don't think in my circle we talk about state politics or local politics at all. And compare that also with being a little mindful about what's threatening our identity at the end of the day. When you log on to Twitter 9 times a day, how do you feel before you logged on before, and how do you feel after? I think individualistically, I think we have to be a little more mindful about that, because essentially nobody will listen to each other anymore is the idea.
Yeah,
A
I would.
yes, Sahid, please.
Yeah, I would like to make some comments and looking back a historical perspective. It has always been the fact that the way to actually weaken an institution is to tighten its bureaucratic mechanisms, which have actually been used for a couple of times in the past. But now it has actually changed. Now we can actually use the words of the mouth to actually reduce the competency of an institution, and exactly what's like being used by this present administration in the United States, where you disregard a lot of institutions, talked about their inability to actually be able to achieve a minor of the minor results. Let's talk about the CIA. The Trump administration actually talked about the CIA and talking about this very strong institutions, and that actually brings to the fore how some of these institutions are underrated. Globally, this is happening, and nationally, it becomes something that is actually very prominent now. Let me talk about in some developing countries now. Some of the institutions have actually collapsed simply because issue-based ideology is being propagated by some of those politicians through the media as an instrument. So in this wise, a lot of people actually disregard that institution by virtue of ideology. So I think Obama was just talking about an ideology kind of movement, because we know from the civil disobedience in the United States, where we have issue of, and also the civil disobedience in India during the Mahatma Gandhi era as well. This has actually been elevated or leveraged more by using the media to actually be able to rubbish competency of some institution. And through that means, politicians can actually find their way to actually ensure that their interest is achieved. So I think that multi-dimensional kind of pathway is being used to actually weaken institutional ability. And looking at international development, Ostrom's idea, he talks about institution is the rule of the game. So how do we manipulate the rule of the game? We manipulate by weakening the rule of the game so as we can achieve their interest. So the actual arena, we have a lot of stakeholders, and these stakeholders felt if I'll force people to buy my idea, I weaken the institution, and by so doing, people do not have access to complain, access to be able to facilitate some of their interests, to process their interests with the government, and through that means I will be at the control and have more hegemonic power to rule.
Yeah, that's actually very true, and something to think about, Saeed. I'm actually, after your comment, I'm feeling a little bad about the fact that we only have some 10 minutes remaining. But I would have loved to continue this discussion that you just brought up on how this is a multidimensional approach that is being taken against maybe an ideology, maybe multilateralism, maybe globalization, and how the institutions are kind of facilitating such an approach and not fighting approaches that are anti-liberal, if one might add. I also want to point out, I think to Shashank's point that was made earlier, Deborah Charles has mentioned that our turn thinking is also nationalism. So we'd be in a better situation to keep that in mind going forward. Now, let me quickly address a question that has come through, because otherwise we'd be being unjust to the patient audiences that we have. Varada Jagde has a question for us, and I'd be happy to pass it on to all of you. he asks, will the global order be possible without hegemony or a particular hegemony? With America's retreating, coming back to the global space that it used to take, and China's aggressive policies and other rising powers like India, not materially capable to balance the world order on their own. So, is there a case for a blank or a vacuum in the global space without a hegemony per se?
Yeah, okay. I have a couple of an idea. I think hegemony is very much vital. It actually shows the level of your understanding of the word game. But how do you allow people? How do you put people together, and how do you allow them to buy your idea without losing the basic of their identity? I think that is exactly what the word leader actually failed to do, and that is exactly why legitimacy was actually very much prominent. US actually came very much good by preaching about democracy, lets people actually be able to bring up new people into government and to make it in form of monarchy. But when you look at the occupation of the United States, for instance, with the Iran, where he has to at one point in time he has to restore the Shah over Muhammad in around 1973, and of course supporting a monarchy system. And later on, a democratic dispensation of prime minister was actually being ousted. And over the time, they've been able to use Iran as a vehicle to transfer arms and ammunition to Soviet Union over there. So when you look at some of these occupations of these world leaders, it actually compromised their position and their legitimacy. And that is exactly what actually brought about the issue of identity, people losing their identity, apart from you forcing them to borrow your ideas, borrow your, they are doing very much fine. I think if they are preaching their national interest, hegemony is very much important, but legitimacy is actually being strengthened by their actions, by their occupations over the years and over time.
So,
Shashank, you had a statement there?
Ishan, you're talking to me?
Yeah. Did you have something to say?
Yes, yes. I actually meaning thank you, Bharat, for that question, right? And if my friend Apit, right, is there, right, he would absolutely love this question, because being the realist that he is, right, from a realist perspective, peace in the long term and the global order, right? And when you say global order, you are talking about that the world to function in a certain manner is possible typically when you have an hegemon. But to say its point, right, if the hegemon slowly loses its legitimacy, right, which is as well as its material strength to kind of continue its hegemonic power, then, as has always happened, a rising power will challenge it, which ultimately will lead to some sort of conflict. Now, it remains to be seen how that conflict will be managed. That is what you see happening right now also, right? That there was a period where US was almost a virtual hegemon. And then we have a rising China as the dark side of globalization. That is also an IR term, right? You can look it up. When the dark side of globalization took over and the institutions set up by US, which underpinned its hegemony, that lost its legitimacy. And after the 2008 financial crisis, the material underpinnings also took a blow. That is when a rising power took shape. And now we see the conflict playing out. How we, as a world order, manage this will define the way going forward. So,
I think that's a very interesting point, Shashank. We have a very interesting comment that has come in from Andy. And I completely agree with this point that we also have to have a discussion of hegemony as a function of MNEs and multinational organizations and enterprises, and not just countries and governments anymore. Because you look at what Amazon and Walmart and IKEA have been doing over the past couple of years. Hegemony maybe needs to be redefined and not just be limited to governments and countries. So that's an excellent point, Andy, and well noted. Let me quickly open it up to John, who's been waiting with his comment for a while, and then I'll go on to conclude the session because we have another panel discussion happening in less than 10 minutes. So, John, you had a statement.
Oh, Thank you, and good job, everyone. This has been amazing. I took a bunch of notes, and I have a lot of thoughts, and my brain juices are working and everything. But we don't have enough time. But you guys definitely mentioned a lot of things, such as identity politics and the identity of the regions expressing itself, and the shift towards regionalism. And you see that in uh, various countries coming together to support their interests with initiatives such as the Quad, NATO, the TPP, and you have this new thing where it's called a TPP. China plus the TPP might join it. But I guess my question is related to multilateral institutions, and really reflecting on a lot of what you've said. So, the purpose of multilateral institutions is to try to manage a lot of international issues, right? But now with the issues of things such as cyber terrorism and a global virus, and trade security, global natural disasters, since a lot of the discussion has been this shift towards more regionalism versus international institutions and whatnot, or rather which country or within the region should be in charge of dealing with these cross-border issues such as COVID-19, right? Or cyber terrorism, or all these new issues that are popping up. So listening to what you guys have said, since it's like regionalism, and say we're in the Asia region, focus on Asia, should China be the country that's in charge of dealing with these cross-border issues, or should it just be left to individual countries?
Let me come in there, John, and let me also give like a panel discussion 101 here. That if you leave with all the answers already on the table, you have nothing left for the next session. So let's leave a couple of questions open ended, and let's leave the audiences with a couple of questions to ponder over. I'd just like to conclude quickly before I thank all of our panelists and the audiences. And before I tell you that we have a panel discussion coming up, so we'll break for 5 minutes and we'll regather again. Let me conclude by saying that it's been an extremely, I think it fits in and it has defined the term ideation that we used in our in the nomenclature of this series, the International Ideation Summit by GPODS, and we have been able to ideate on some of the most interesting concepts that I haven't thought of recently, including the concept of polarization, the changing world dynamics, the effect of COVID, the effect of multilateral organizations, the effect of the current elections that have just happened in the US, how that would have an impact on the economy and the fiscal measures that are being taken, as Srija mentioned, in terms of FDI and otherwise. Its impact on regional organizations and Quad and such other organizations, as John mentioned, that have been coming up. Maybe there's unipolarity for good, maybe there's hegemony for bad, maybe there are none. And that's the whole challenge of the New World Order. So with that positive and negative undertone to the whole discussion, I thank all of my panelists, including Shashank, Moshmi, Sneha, Saheed, Srija, Malika, for joining us. I also thank all of the panel audiences, because I know that you've been patient with your questions and with your comments. The good thing is that there's more to come, and we shift completely from IR and diplomacy centered topic that we were discussing now to a sustainability centered topic, which is COVID-19 and the wildlife causation and consequences of wildlife trade. So that's happening in 5 minutes. I hope that all of you do stay on, because if the first discussion was anything to go by, we are going to be having a lot of engaging discussions over the next 2 days. So thank you all of the panelists. And again, I know that a lot of you have thought a lot about this, researched even, and we could not have had a better start to our 2-day series. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ishan.
Thank you, Ishan.
So we'll
Thanks,
just
folks. Thanks, Ishan.
Yeah, thank you. We'll just break for 5 minutes and regather again. I hope that all of you do stay on, and it's going to be another engaging discussion. So hope to see you on the other side of the 5 minutes, guys. Thank you. forgot to introduce myself in the excitement of the last discussion. I am the co-director of the Global Policy, Diplomacy and Sustainability Fellowship. And in truly GPODS fashion, where the whole idea is to work towards the intersection of diplomacy, sustainability, and public policy, we now jump from international relations to wildlife, public health, uh, environment, sustainability, and the discussion that ensues when we talk about those things. So without further ado, I request Aditi if we could go live as well, and we'll start our discussion. So let me welcome the panelists here. We're joined by Himaki Kumari. She has a video on. If you guys can see her. We're joined by Shivangi. I'm going in the order they're visible on my screen. So Shivangi Adani has joined us as well for this discussion. We are joined by Ria as well, who's wearing a Harry Potter scarf, I notice, and Arundhati as well. So hi Arundhati, glad to have all of you. You're all extremely intellectually able to handle this heavy duty discussion that we have planned for the next 1.5 hours. So I see my job as a moderator being reduced thanks to all of your progress. So that being said, let's talk about the topic a little before we get into the discussion. Again, you're free to introduce yourself when you start with the discussion. Now, from the past and what is happening globally in the political sphere, we move into the present and what is happening globally in environmental sphere, in the repercussions in international relations of what is happening. And the most pressing issue that all of us are facing, and the reason why this is being held online, is the coronavirus disease 19 pandemic, or the COVID pandemic, as some people would like to call it. And there have been borders that have been drawn again, and there has been a lot of discussion on how it has been handled, how it should have been handled, how it is being handled, the vaccines coming through. But it would be, the whole discussion would be lacking if we do not discuss why it has happened and what caused it, what are the consequences of it, what are the consequences of wet markets, what are the consequences of wildlife trade, legal and illegal, what are the consequences of captivity and the axiological views that ensue, and what are the consequences of a world order that is not ready to control wildlife trade, illegal or legal. We go into the various dimensions of all of these topics over the next discussion. I hope that all of our audience members participate as you did the last time around. And we would keep admitting all of you, all the people who keep joining in. So please be assured that your questions and statements will be taken note of. That's my job. So I'll make sure that that happens properly. So let's begin with the whole discussion. And I throw it open to anyone who wants to join in from our panel members, including Himaki, Shivangi, Ria, and Arundhati, as I mentioned. What is COVID and why is COVID? And how do we assess what COVID has done and why has it happened? Apart from it being the obvious pandemic that we're all having to deal with as well. So any thoughts to begin with? Let me go to Shivangi first, and then we'll move on to the others if there are any views on what for you defines COVID, and how it has changed everyday life or global politics or the way you look at environment.
Thanks, Ishan. Hi, everyone. This is Shivangi, and I am an environment lawyer by profession. What is COVID is a very difficult question to ask, but bringing it in context to our discussion today, I think one of the most important positive effects that COVID has had is that it has thrown light on issues that are plaguing the world, be it environment or social or labor issues. Considering our discussion is environment and wildlife, we will speak about that. But for me, I would say that it's just the light that COVID has thrown upon the issues and how we need to move forward from that. And also that, we in the beginning we used to talk about the post-COVID world. How are we going to change? I feel like we're already in the post-COVID world. So, and not much has changed. So where do we go from here? That's me for now.
I think that's a very interesting point, Shivangi, because we don't really think of or associate any positivity with COVID-19 because, it has caused unfortunate deaths. It's caused unfortunate loss for all of us. But maybe there has been a certain resurrection of environment, if you will, and maybe even of wildlife, which is what we'll be delving into going forward, because the trade must have taken a hit because of the border restraints that have been happening. So, what caused COVID is the general question that we'd like to start with. We know that it is argued that it originated in Wuhan in China. It is argued that it originated from one of the wet markets, and the historical relevance of those wet markets is something that we'll also delve into. So let me open it up to the panel and discuss where do we draw from when it comes to these wet markets and the rights of wildlife, illegal trade, the virility myth, as one of our mentors, Arvind Rosenkrantz, talked about. And yes, please feel free to jump in and let's get the conversation rolling.
Hi, thanks, Ishan. I'm Himaki. I am currently just part of this fellowship, not doing anything at the moment, but studying. So it was a very interesting point, Shivangi, about that how we have to analyze the positive effects of the COVID, which has been there, which we'll be discussing over time. But coming back to the main question which Ishan has asked is what could be one of the main causes of COVID, which has been linked to wildlife trade. There are actually three causes, explainable causes for this COVID. One was actually related with, which is actually called the proximal cause, which from an animal, it gets passed on to the animal host, and it's the animal narrative. Then the other narrative was actually by this very famous biologist, Jane Goodall, who actually called it the animal-human narrative about how it gets. She further reasoned it by suggesting that because of human interaction with the animals and depleting resources and how their habitat is being affected, so that's how it leads to more zoonotic diseases. And the third causal explanation, which is actually very famous amongst the conspiracy theorists, is the lab animal human narrative, where how the Chinese were actually, making sure that there was they were building this virus and they wanted to attack the world and everything. So these were the three various causal explanation of the COVID outbreak, interestingly. But what could be taken, the main piece can be taken from this is that um, human interaction with the animals and is an unintended consequence in this COVID world, right? So the way we interact with the animals has kind of led to increase in most of these epidemics. Like 75% of the epidemics which have taken place has happened via animals. So yeah, that's what I want to say.
So that puts into light the prominence of wildlife and the hand that it plays in these pandemics, and we're going to touch upon the whole concept of legal and illegal trade. But going back to the three causes that Himaki referred to, maybe not all three are as legitimate as one claims, and maybe there's a specific role played by wet markets. So is there an explanation as to why it started in the first place? Why did these wet markets come about in the first place? And is there anything being done to regulate those? Because as Himaki said, pandemics and epidemics have been taking place through this wildlife trade that is being passed on from animals to humans. So I'm not even going to stretch it to include labs in that equation, but let's keep it simple and talk about animals and humans and how these wildlife trade has been taking place in wet markets across the globe, but more so prominently in China, because that's what it is argued, that's where it originated. So what is the dichotomy of these wet markets? Is there a positive to these wet markets?
Hi, Ishan.
Hi, Arundhati. Yes, please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Arundhati, and currently I'm a GPODS fellow. Just adding to what Shivangi and Himaki said, I think that these epidemics or the zoonotics are nothing new to the world, but as it has been rightly pointed out, that it is probably the SOS signal right now that we have to take action. And as you were talking about the wet markets, and we have to link them back. I think there's a reason that wild animals are called wild, and these wet markets, the conditions are not always very favorable, where they're just densely populated. And I think it brings us more than talking about there's no concrete solution, but brings us to a lot of introspection and thought process about our own eating habits and the wet markets. Because I know that uh, for humans, the positive side has to be the economics of it. There is very interesting supply and demand dynamics to it. But at the same time, we know that for the nature, for the ecosystem, they're not always the most favorable or right thing.
That's an interesting point, Arundhati, and I see that I was trying to create a background for the topic, and you've delved directly into the anthropocentric nature of things. So let's head into that then, that part of the discussion as to how there is almost always a tug of war between ecocentrism and anthropocentric views, and how wet markets or illegal wildlife trade is in existence, even in the best case scenario for human benefits. Yeah, let's lead into that discussion. I know that Ria has a couple of views on this issue. Ria, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great discussion to delve both into the legal and illegal wildlife trade. And if we actually look into the history of pandemics, there's actually a lot of viruses and bacteria that have come through the legal wildlife trade, which is something that we haven't really monitored well so far. In fact, if you look at it, there's about 220 million animals that are imported into the US every year, which are part of the legal wildlife trade. And if we actually look at it, both the illegal and legal wildlife trade include animals that are used for primarily three commodities, which is food, pets, and medicine. And if you actually look into this, uh, actually, sorry, I'm just going to pick up an example of our anthropocentrism with the mink in Denmark. So we observed that there was a different strain of COVID that was developing within these mink that are kept in captivity in densely packed cages that are where they are sharing fluids, in fact. So if you look at some of these videos that we have, you'll see that the cages that are packed on top, the fluids of those go down to the bottom, and that is how these diseases spread. And all of this happens simply because we feel, I mean, we act as though it is our right to be extracting any kind of utility out of these animals. I think it's an interesting moral and philosophical discussion. But yeah, I think we can come back to that. But captivity and the use of wildlife within our lives is something I think we need to think a little more about.
I think, again, a very interesting point, Ria, because in case the audience members do not know, the Danish government, and please, my colleagues are free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Danish government actually ordered the killing of 15 million minks in Denmark, because as Ria mentioned, they were developing this different strain of COVID virus that would have been difficult to contain. And and it's almost the harsh irony that the illegal wildlife trade, or the legal wet markets as they were in China, which were there for the killing of these animals, which led to this disease coming through, led to further killing of these animals because they started responding to these strains that were being spread across the globe. And again, I don't want to get into the morality of the discussion, right, uh, the wildlife captivity, and maybe we'll also touch upon the game reserves of Africa and how hunting is legal. But just opening it up about how it is almost a cycle of it wildlife trade perpetuates wildlife trade, and wildlife killing perpetuates wildlife killing, as we can see. I know that Shivangi wanted to talk a little about the minks as well. So Shivangi, if you have any points there.
Um, Not about the minks at this point, considering we're not speaking about morality. We can get to that a little later into the discussion. But just a couple of points from what everybody has spoken about, since we're using the term wet markets. Just about the terminology that we used. I think we need to differentiate between wet markets, wildlife markets, and farmers markets. What I've realized through research and readings is that using the term wet markets, the first thing that comes to our mind is China. Um, and we think that, okay, there are all these creatures that people don't generally eat, like bats and snakes. But I think it's just um, comes under the anti-China approach, if I may say so, because even if you look at farmers markets and wildlife markets in the rest of the world, you have creatures like octopuses that are being sold, right? But it's just the different terminology that's being used. So even when we're looking at where did the virus come from, I don't know about the international relations point of view, but in going forward, I feel like it shouldn't matter. We need to look at it through like a global perspective, and also look at the farmers markets that are also being like the legal wildlife trade, not just the illegal wildlife trade. So that's just one point that I wanted to discuss about the kind of terminology that we use, because I think it affects psychology a lot.
So Shivangi is absolutely against calling it the China virus then.
That's another discussion altogether.
All right, but I think again a very important point is raised that we have it on our hands, and we have it's a factum of life that there are these wildlife markets, or farmers markets, or wet markets, and we are dealing with the pandemic as a world, and maybe causation should be just that, causation, and not be turned into a blame game that is being played internationally, because that kind of paddles into the conveniences of certain institutions and governments. So completely, absolutely well taken, Shivangi. We'll also get into the morality of the discussion. I do understand that all of us have had a pre-discussion on that as well. But I just want to set the facts straight as to where this has come from, and why wet markets, which we are almost using interchangeably with illegal wildlife trade, are actually legal in nature. And they are a government organized market, at least the one in Wuhan was. So, as Shivangi rightly pointed out, there's a case to study both legal and illegal wildlife trade. And as Ria pointed out, and let me specify in case anyone missed it, Ria did bring to light that 220 million animals are imported in the US, only in the US, and that's one country, and we're talking about a country that's not even the biggest importer of wildlife. So that's the scale of legal wildlife trade that we're talking about. And obviously, then there are black markets. The conditions of such wildlife are not as well regulated as one would hope. And as Ria again mentioned, that fluids drip from one cage to another, viruses transfer from one species to another. And let me also put into perspective how difficult it is for a virus to jump from one species to another. And in this case, it is being suggested that it jumped from a bat to a pangolin to a human. So the probability of that happening is extremely low. And if you do have to do a quick mathematical roundup, the sample size of such instances happening has to be very, very large for it to happen successfully even once. So that just puts into perspective the kind of the volume of the wildlife trade and the volume of the captivity in which these species are bunched up together that we're talking of. So that makes for an interesting discussion, and all of this is being done for the benefit of humankind. And when the humankind suffers, as Shivangi said, we do end up blaming someone from where it's originated. But let me also specify that there are enough wet markets, maybe not used with the same tone or the undertone that we use for the wet markets in China, but there are wet markets in existence all over Africa. There are wet markets loosely defined in India as well. So there's a pandemic waiting to be to be happening every couple of years if it's not regulated. And we'll also go into the whole concept of how we could probably find a solution to this wildlife trade in wet markets, and maybe the rights of animals that are inherent to those animals, and nothing much beyond it. But let's get into the whole concept of captivity and how that snowballs into another discussion altogether. Because captivity could be captivity in the form of reserves, it could be captivity in the form of wet markets and farmers markets, as Shivangi eloquently put, or it could be captivity for being hunted, as is happening in South Africa and a bunch of other African nations that I know of. So, how far would you justify the Anthropocene nature of such activities, if at all you would? And if not, then what is the way around it?
Um, Sorry, if
Priya,
I could,
go ahead. Yes.
yeah, if I could just jump in. I think that all of these activities do have an anthropocentric vision, but I think that the way that this is done is different. In the sense that, so if we are looking at larger wildlife, and so if you're looking at tigers and rhinoceros that we're trying to conserve, we do that in a much different fashion. Captivity is not something that makes a lot of difference, and it's not something that's going to produce pandemics, because it's not like these are animals that are kept in densely packed areas. So the effort there is to try to mimic nature and to allow them to have a habitat that we are maintaining and conserving. So I think this is something that we need to be treating differently when we talk about the conservation of different kinds of animals or the propagation of them. Yeah, I think I'll come back to my point if somebody wants to interject.
I just want to bring about this point on captive breeding. One important point being is that wildlife trade is to make it completely illegal. It's like sidelining a full parallel economy which runs because of the wildlife trade, right? Because there's a meat economy, there's a fur economy, and there's a lot of other people who rely on this wildlife trade. So one way to go about captive, if you start captive breeding certain species and animals, whether it's for research and development, I mean, during a pandemic, you do need a vaccine, and for that vaccine, you need to experiment on certain animals. And how do you get those animals? It's because of captive breeding. Second, if you are so in a way, in an indirect way, you can say that captive breeding could be one of the ways to mitigate the effects of wildlife trade into the environment. And at the same time, it's a very difficult fight to completely abolish wildlife trade, but there's a way which could be done about how we can work in tandem, and I think captive breeding could be one way to go about it.
Shivangi, do you want to say something? I'm sorry, Arundhati, you go first, please.
I'm going to let Arundhati first.
Yes, please go ahead.
I think I completely agree with Himaki on the point that we cannot just blanket ban wet markets completely, because a lot of I think even human livelihood reliance on that. But another thing which we can do is we could maybe slowly create alternate employment mechanisms around the places where wet markets take place, or around the places where there's a supply and demand side of it. And at the same time, we have more solutions coming up, for example, lab grown meat. So that is something which can be further looked into. Shivangi?
I actually agree with Himaki, Ishan, that we can't do away with wildlife trade at this point, and advocating for shutting down wet markets or killing minks to reduce the impact of the pandemic is the way to go forward, because that again impacts us as humans, right? Take what Arundhati said about giving alternate opportunities. So what happened with minks is all the farmers who were breeding minks, they suddenly over few weeks they ran out of their livelihood. They didn't know what to do. So before we advocate for shutting down wildlife markets and wildlife trade, we need to first take a step back and think about the livelihood options. And I think instead of shutting down, regulating is the key. Also, again, what Arundhati spoke about hygiene in wet markets. Probably maintaining some hygiene standards is one way of regulating wet markets so that they don't have to shut down.
I think that's an interesting point. Maybe instead of addressing or having a blanket discussion on stopping wildlife trade and stopping wet markets, we probably need to address the nitty-gritties of the supply and demand of it. And also, maybe there's also a case to discuss the equitable impacts of that supply and demand. So usually it's the already tarnished communities that suffer more because of such wildlife trade and illegal hunting and such, and poaching, if you will. And it's usually a certain segment of the population which is already comparatively better off than others who are the ones demanding such artifacts or heirlooms or all of those things. So there is a chasm of supply and demand that needs some addressing before we go on to dispel the whole idea that it should be completely illegally banned. Maybe regulation is the way to go, but how do we regulate the supply and demand then?
Um, Before we get into conversation regulation, I just want to, bring about the point about who exactly are the consumers of the wildlife trade. We all know it's the privileged and the elite. We all know when the income rises, there is a rise in the wildlife trade. They want to live, an ostentatious lifestyle, which is really important. And, owning that special material is, kind of adds more, adds a little value in the social circle, right? And I think second part is, of course, behavioral, that it brings you luck or, like a spirituality aspect to it. Uh, which is really, that's what people tend to do that. And the third aspect would be, I guess, I think just for the thrill and the game of it, like trophy hunting, right? When you kill, you just want to keep something as a memory. You want to, show it to people about it. So I think we know to be able to regulate the demand side, it's going to be very difficult because then you have to regulate a lot of other mechanisms about how we function economically as well, because it's the rich who are dealing with it at all. Now, how do you tell the rich not to buy it? I think there was a very nice campaign which was done in Thailand, where sorry, in China, where they had to make sure ivory wasn't sold at fees in China, and they actually started a behavioral campaign. If you keep ivory with you, it brings you bad luck. So this was one campaign that was started with China. So I think besides regulation, behavioral could be one aspect which you can look into it. Just my 2 cents on it. So yeah.
That's an interesting point, actually, Maki, and behavior then feeds into, because as it is, we've talked about how wildlife is almost uh, a very heavy industry as it is, and it'll be difficult to regulate it en masse. And maybe there are segments of it that you start addressing and strands of it that you start taking out, including by changing the behavior patterns of the rich, so to speak, and also the poor communities who have to indulge in these actions because they have no other source of livelihood. So maybe that's a good first step, because we must bring to the fore in this discussion the wildlife tourism that happens, the exotic meats that are served in restaurants around the world. So there's obviously a demand for it, and and as we market 101 is that if there's a demand for something, there will be a supply of that thing, and then the price of that would be determined on the basis of the lack of one or the other, or the abundance of one or the other.
Can I just add one thing to your point?
Yes, please.
About 68% of these consumers are sitting in America. Sorry, this is one report I had read. So yeah.
All right, so that's an interesting point. Maybe we start with making America great again then, and cutting down on the wildlife consumption there. Yes, so any other thoughts on the topic? We've obviously discussed the supply and demand side of it. Maybe there is something to be added there as well.
Can I add something? This may stray away a little from our focus on wildlife, but I think there's a report that says even if the entire world turns to, say, a plant-based diet and they stop meat, consumption, that will reduce our carbon emissions only by some amount in 2 digits. Okay, that still has climate change impacts, even if we are all plant-based. The ice caps are still melting. There are reports that say that there are viruses waiting to just waiting to happen under the permafrost. So I think there's another whole angle to that, and it's not just consumption. It's all interconnected.
I do agree it's all interconnected, Shivangi, but I have to say I'm a little surprised that that I was expecting your views to be extremely that no, we should stop wildlife and it's like trade and there's something absolutely wrong with it and we should put a stop to it. But I do
Just
like the fact that you're acknowledging that it is an imperative and probably a necessary evil, and that's not the only thing to be blamed.
I have a plugin for GPODS. I think it helps you
All right.
get perspective.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. 10 points for Shivangi there. Anyway, continuing Shivangi's conversation, I think she makes an important point that uh, even despite all of the trade that is happening, uh, pandemics have happened in the past, and there was a Spanish flu. Obviously, there was the bubonic plague. There have been pandemics, but we all scientists point towards the increasing frequency of these Ebola, SARS, and now COVID-19, and it will be difficult to take out wildlife trade as much as Shivangi might want from the conversation of the pandemics that are being caused in the first place. So let us touch upon something that Ria actually mentioned earlier, which was the whole preservation captivity or preservation wildlife trade versus the morality of exploitation. And I think we all would agree that exploitation of wildlife is not something that should be promoted. While it might be a necessary evil because of the market dynamics, but still it is probably not the most moral of acts. And obviously there are other professions that could be argued are not as moral either. For example, that of an executioner. But in terms of morality, one could also argue that captivity for preservation is a necessary evil for the preservation of that species. But it's captivity nonetheless. And as soon as you legitimize captivity of any sorts, you're also legitimizing uh, all of the channels through which that captivity does take place. So you have buying and selling of animals for that captivity. You have buying and selling of wildlife to preserve that wildlife as well, as the example of rhinoceros or um, any of the other species that are trying to be preserved. So where do you draw the line then in terms of morality, in terms of ethics of wildlife? And I know that these are very difficult questions to answer, and none of us probably will have a yes or no or right or wrong here. But just as a piece of discussion, it makes for an interesting conversation as to what defines the morality and where do you draw the line. Let's take, for example, someone you're trying to preserve as a species.
Uh,
Um,
Ishan, can I please add something to the grim situation which Shivwangi spoke about? And, because you were bringing up morality and we had the whole discussion around the minks. Also around 1990s, when a strain of bird flu break out in some regions of Asia, apparently China had also killed around 300 million geese in the farms to control the situation. So I think that the question of morality is very important, because do we, I don't think that controlling this and considering the wildlife as a problem and then regulating it in this way is a solution to, we have to think in a way where we can coexist peacefully. So that is there.
I think, Ria, you were also raising a point there.
yeah, just jumping in to say, I think this relates a little bit to the supply side of what we were talking about earlier, and um, just basically that. Oh my God, I'm sorry. 1 second, I'll be back.
No, that's all right. So going to the supply side of things, we must also let's dial it down and go to the roots of the whole issue. Let's go to let's visualize ourselves in a reserve forest, and X person is a dweller of a village nearby, and he's making it very difficult. It's very difficult for him to make both ends meet. So,
Yeah.
what is the low hanging fruit there? Ria, would you want to continue?
Yeah, I was talking about the same thing actually, but when we talk about morality, it is subjective to the circumstances of people. So just looking at the supply side of the illegal wildlife trade, especially if we look at and we look at poaching in places. So in India, if you look at the statistics, there's been like a 151% rise on the poaching in India during the period of the lockdown, which is obviously an economic consequence of the lockdown itself. And I think these are things that can be dealt in different ways, looking at particular situations. So there might be people who cannot make ends meet, and that there it is our responsibility to be building alternative career paths, alternative professions that these guys can follow, so that this doesn't happen. Whereas this might be different in different contexts, where there is armed poaching and there are people who are doing this for lots of money, and there I think it is the legal mandates that we need to strengthen, so that this decreases. Yeah, that is one of the things that
Yeah,
we should.
I think that's a very interesting point, because Ria has pointed out, as opposed to almost the preconceived notion that people who cannot make both their ends meet, delve into such practices of illegal hunting or poaching or trophy hunting or those sort of things. But it's actually both ends of the spectrum. Some people who are power brokers of those circles, and who organize these black markets of illegal trade, are also once indulging in something like this. I also want to point out quickly before we move ahead in the conversation that the market dynamics are such that the rarer the commodity, so the more endangered a species is, the higher price it fetches, which creates more incentive for someone to supply that rare commodity. So it also, the whole structure is such of market dynamics, or however you want to put it, that it almost perpetuates or gives a larger reward for killing a rare species or an endangered species or a red plus plus species. And that's something that needs to be noticed as well, because as we go towards the whole idea of how do these wildlife economics work, we also have to then think that the more endangered a species is, or the lesser of them, the more price it will fetch going forward.
Can I just add to Ria's point
Yes, please.
about how poachers actually need this? Their main driver is money, and to be able to maintain their financial gain. But there was a study done in Tanzania in these 10 villages, and they realized that poachers actually are not mired by extreme poverty. These are poachers who are looking for additional income. They have a house, they are getting food, but they want an upward mobility in the social ladder in the village. So they need that extra money. So they are doing well to do amongst other villages, but they need to prove it to others that they want to actually go upward in the ladder, that okay, we are doing well for ourselves. So when they were told that why do you want to, so there were these people who were little old traditional value that we actually, these are those proper indigenous communities who are like, for us the wildlife matters more. We are for the animal. We cannot be doing this. And then the newer generation who has seen a different side of the economics, who want to be out there in the society, are actually indulging into poaching. So I guess adding to your market dynamics, somewhere again, I'm coming back to this whole generational, from the generation lens, that also matters a lot. So I think in a way, what could be done is, if we could be preserving this indigenous communities practice about how they deal with the wildlife and how they are, you need to preserve them and provide them with incentives like send their children to school, or if there could be more regulations to be able to make sure they are able to contain it. So yeah.
Can I jump in right
Yes,
there?
please, Shivangi.
Adding to what Himaki said, I think this ties into the conversation on human and animal conflict. That coexistence is a myth. Another reason that a lot of villagers who turn into poachers, or they're not even like poachers regularly, but they sometimes hunt animals because of revenge. Because these animals, especially villages who are close to, say, a forest, when these animals go and attack their livestock, So it's again what kind of facilities that the government is providing to the villages so that their livestock is protected, so they are compensated if a wild animal goes and attacks the livestock and eats their harvest. So it's also a governance issue.
I think that's a very, very interesting point because we often look at it in very black and white terms that, poaching is bad, but it could happen that, it could be a revenge kill, as Shivangi pointed out, where a tiger or a leopard can come in and eat your cattle and you're left with nothing. And that's your sole source of survival. So that is a good way to talk about governance structures of how you regulate or incentivize non-killing as much as you make it a punishable crime within your structures. Because as we know, that policy works both ways. One is the rehabilitative policy where you punish someone and try and rehabilitate their behavior. And then there's the nudge economics that is catching up, where you nudge someone's behavior towards a certain thing through incentives and disincentives. But I know that Himaki has some experience working with the indigenous communities as well. So when you talk of indigenous practices of preservation, conservation, non-killing, how does that work? How does that play out in the real world? Do we have any examples of what sort of conservation mechanisms are undertaken?
So I'll give you very interesting example which I've actually seen. So I was working in Nagaland, and Nagaland, the tribal people are known. They're the hunters, right? They hunt animals. And in the 70s, I reached a point where this bird called tragopan was actually being extinct. And now there were these few people who realized, and they were actually losing out on food because they used to actually live on tragopan. They used to feed it. So they were hunting for fun and they were hunting for food. So that's when the realization came that you have to draw a line where you need to preserve these animals. You cannot be always eating them because you're running out of food and you look for alternatives. So then this tribe, which is actually in Kanoma village, actually from hunters they became preservers, and they realized that you have to preserve your resources, because somewhere down the line, again, going back to your dialogue, anthropocentricity, because you have to think about yourself, you have to preserve the nature so you have ample amount of resources. So they were able to, for them, the nature comes first, these indigenous communities. And at the same time, you actually used to kill animals to eat, you used to kill animals for medicinal uses. And again, this is the newer generation who did it, but the older generation actually had other alternative ways of having medicinal uses and other alternate resources. So in a way, they made sure they were able to preserve this knowledge, and the upcoming generations could use it about how you preserve your nature and the wildlife. So that could be one way of conservation, to have a proper code of conduct and preserve this knowledge. So yeah.
That's actually quite interesting. I mean, there have been examples in recent times, not specifically about wildlife, but what happened with New Zealand and the Wanganui River and the Maori communities, where communal rights of the land were given to the community as a whole for them to preserve, because for them, nature meant a lot more than it did to the government, because ultimately it's a resource for the government and it's a way of life for a certain community. So maybe there are trends that could be followed across the world. I know that there are Ecuadorian forests and Bolivian mountains that are doing something similar in terms of indigenous rights and way of handling wildlife resources and natural resources. Maybe,
Sorry.
yes, please go ahead.
Thing is, that was indigenous communities. Now the wildlife trade has become an organized crime. And now, when it becomes an organized crime, how do you control it? Because there are so many regulatory frameworks which are there to control this organized crime. But for wildlife, it's not as strict as it should be for how it is for the organized crime for drugs or the organized crime for sex trafficking and everything. So it is not as strict as that. And yeah, I'm sorry, I just had to bring this point. Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, I could argue that the laws in place internationally and nationally, domestically, if we talk of India and some of the other countries that I have studied, the laws are quite strict. But I think with every law, especially in the developing world, but more so, more and more in the developed world as well, implementation of those laws is something that has been lacking. I mean, there is an imprisonment, direct imprisonment. It's a non-bailable offense in India, but the implementation and who goes scot free. There are instances in news reports that I have followed that sometimes it's the forest officers and the guards that are also working hand in glove with these poachers. So implementation mechanisms, governance mechanisms, and also going back to Shivangi's point that probably there's a need for being proactive on the governance side of it before dealing with the source of the issue.
The thing is, the framework, I'm so sorry, the framework needs to be adaptable towards time because now the organized crime has reached digital. You have all these poachers, trading wildlife commodities online, and through these encrypted messages and everything. So we still now don't have a proper regulatory framework when it comes to data policies or online. So I think that is one way of addressing as well, because now our criminals are way ahead of our lawyers. I mean, I know I'm speaking to a lawyer, but they are thinking ahead. So and we're a little slow on our process. So yeah.
Adding to Himaki's point, and again with wildlife law implementation, from what I've seen is it's not given enough importance. Our judges don't know much about wildlife law, especially in the lower courts where the matters are first heard. Our forest guards don't know enough about wildlife law. Of course, there are great efforts being conducted. They are being given trainings so that they can implement these laws better. But another point is the hostility that the forest guards and the villagers have against each other. Forest guards can't often report the crimes because they belong to the same village where there are other people who are going and committing the crime. So we just need to think of solutions.
I think that's an interesting point. Ria, did you have point there? Or
Uh, Sure.
okay.
I mean, I was just thinking about the time. So the WWF has a lot of forest guards that we fund and take care of, and a lot of times it is exactly that. You don't have the support of the villagers. But like just to offer like one case study that was really interesting with the snow leopards in Ladakh. There have been a lot of community conservation programs that were activated, and generally revenge killing and human predator, I mean human animal conflict comes about because the animals have been damaging a part of the economic wherever the humans are taking an income from. So in Ladakh, for example, they kill a lot of livestock. So there was a program in which corrals were put, and within those corrals, the sheep and lamb that the people have are safe. And that really worked wonders, and it also changed a lot of the mindsets that had been ingrained there in that community for a long while. And once the communities around the places where wildlife is are champions for the wildlife, and they're also gaining from them in terms of tourism and other things. I mean, there is no better protection that we can offer in those terms. So I think there's a lot to be done in the field of behavior science and working with communities to help them gain the benefits of wildlife instead of the detriments.
That's actually true. And talking of innovation, I know that Shivangi had a couple of ideas about innovation and how the illegal killing, at least, could be regulated through the use of cameras and other technology that you might want to spell out.
Yeah, I had one. I read about drones. That drones can be an effective tool in tackling wildlife crime and even deforestation, not just crime. Um, because they can give an aerial view of what's happening inside a forest, and somebody from outside the forest can handle them. Otherwise, we have guards who are walking for hours, taking patrols in the mornings and in the nights. Their health is also compromised, so they're in a tough spot. And now we have the technology, but again, like Himaki mentioned, we don't have adequate data protection laws for internet, how it's being treated on the internet. We still don't have laws for like how to regulate drones. But in India, I believe drones are being used in 2 national parks, and I think that could be a great solution to explore to at least reduce crime to some level. I also had another point, just thinking about what Ria mentioned, and while we're talking about protecting tigers and all the other larger animals, I'm not sure. The pandemics that the viruses that they come from the smaller animals. How do we shift our focus to conserving and protecting them? Just a question.
That's a very, very interesting question. Would anyone want to go answer it? I have another subminimal version of that question, but I'll put it across later.
I think I could take a shot. I feel personally that it's not generally pandemics come out of captivity and mass breeding of animals. So it's not conservation that drives captivity, it's consumption that does. So I feel like these are things that can be tackled differently. And if you're looking at smaller mammals, it is, I mean, small, I don't really mean smaller, but any animals that we are breeding for consumption, um, those are completely different from the ones that we are breeding for conservation. We're not exactly breeding, but we're giving a habitat to for them to live out their lives without human interruption. So I think that just occupies a different space altogether. And if you're looking at the ones to prevent further pandemics, if we were, I think we'd have to look at captivity and the idea that you can have mass production and mass breeding of animals for a particular purpose. And if I mean, I'm sure that we can't really dismantle the whole mass breeding industry in a year or whatever, but I mean, if we are doing that, we need to be looking at checks and balances and stringent health guidelines that are followed across to be looking at decreasing the threat of pandemics or other diseases rising from those.
Anyone else with views on what Shivangi asked? Otherwise, I have, as I mentioned, another layer to the question.
I just had to add to what Ria had said. I think to prevent future pandemics, and we are focusing on wildlife and how because of captivity, a lot of has taken place. But also, I think there is also an issue of illegal deforestation, illegal mining, and all these other problems, which I think put these wildlife, these animals under a lot of strain, and that also is a cause of the whole. That also causes a lot of you can say a negative chain reaction about how a disease can be spread.
So one thing that I'm realizing as we discuss this more and more is that it's a lot bigger, the problem, than what we perceive it to be. There's an ecosystem of the problem itself that is almost self-funded because of all the trade that happens in it, legal and otherwise. So maybe it requires multifold solutions and not just a one-stop shop that can help us prevent future pandemics through preventing illegal wildlife trade. But to add to Shivangi's question that she raised earlier, if we do concentrate on preservation of an endangered species versus a non-endangered species, or if we do concentrate on smaller mammals or smaller animals as against bigger animals, because those are the ones that have caused pandemics and epidemics historically, then if that is the case, and this is obviously we have to choose, this is a real world and it's not an idealistic world where you have limited resources, so you can only use them to a certain extent on a certain species and not equally or across all species, which would be the idealistic view. Then where does that figure into the scheme of morality? That you're saving an endangered species over another species, you're saving a smaller mammal because it might cause deaths of humans as against a bigger mammal which is safe for humans to subsist.
Sorry, if I could just try that. I think all of our conservation is very anthropocentric, and the reason that we want to conserve these species in the first place is because we can't really live without them, and our systems are incomplete
You're
without
right,
them.
the topic of discussion is COVID in wildlife, so that's telling there itself.
Absolutely, yeah. But if we look deeper into the science of it, the reason why we look at usually what we are referring to as larger mammals or more charismatic species are how they refer to. These are generally predators that are top of the food chain, and they indicate the health of the whole ecosystem that they're within, which is why we try to conserve them first. So I feel like the threat to us that we have from viruses coming in from particular kinds of animals, those are generally not the ones that are endangered as well. But yeah, I feel like the question on morality of which species we're looking to conserve definitely stands. But if you look at it from the point of view that our vision of conservation in itself is anthropocentric, then we are only looking to conserve those that are running out and those that will make a large difference to our lives in the future.
So baby steps, basically. Let's address this model issue first and be at peace with the fact that this is an Anthropocene world, and let's address that first. Shivangi, you had something to say?
Um, yeah, a lot of thoughts, but I feel like we blame our anthropocentric approach for getting us to where we are. But is there a, I'm asking questions because that's what's coming to me through our discussion, but is there a way to, infuse this approach with morality? Because we are selfish people and we are never going to take ourselves out of the equation, which is what I think we have established. Whatever solution we whatever solution we think of is for our benefit. So instead of trying to shift to another approach, why not just infuse this approach with morality?
That's a very interesting point. And Himaki, I know you have something to say, but let me just top off what Shivangi is saying and then come to you. Let me refer to, so for our audiences who do not know much about the GPODS fellowship structure, apart from dedicated classes on sustainability, global commons, CPA, comparative public administration, public policy, and international relations and diplomacy, we also have mentors who come in who talk about their experiences and how they've dealt with certain scenarios within these three tracks. And one of our mentors, Mr. Satya Tripathi, during his lecture, had said to him, to Shivangi's point, that anthropocentrism needs to be utilized for behavioral changes. So you humans are, the Hobbesian view of humans is that we are all selfish in nature. So pander to that, how you would benefit from having by leading certain lifestyle, or how you would benefit by not killing animals. Maybe give them an incentive of not having pandemics and being able to go out on a regular basis and not having to wear mask or not be restricted to Zoom calls and online conferences. But there are enough incentives that even anthropocentrism can provide to humanity to change their behavior in terms of behavioral change, obviously. Himaki, sorry.
No, no,
I
that was a great point. I've learned about anthropocentrism in your class itself, so I can think that way. And I was getting to Shivangi's point about how behavior change is really important. Just 2 points. When you're making certain policies and regulations with regards to wildlife conservation, we need to make communication is a very important part, and it needs to induce anthropocentrism for the simple reason that's what drives humans. Very interestingly, there was this really, I think it's a long time back, I had read during the COVID time, that there was this experiment done in UK for these three group of people who were trying to understand. You have to go and donate money in three various ways. One was if you think, COVID so they were explained speak of the way the causal explanation of COVID, right? Whether it was the animals approach, whether it was the animal human interactive approach, whether it was a lab approach. And according to that, you had to go and donate money towards wildlife conservation. And I kid you not, maximum people actually took that route of animal and human interaction and donated money towards wildlife preservation, showing the fact that once when you put human into that factor, suddenly your this altruistic side of yours actually increases. So yeah, I think it's very important when you are inducing this behavioral change over conservation. You need to put human in the center, because for human the world revolves around them, so it's that environment revolves around them. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very positive note, and we've opened the chat box up for questions. So please feel free to chuck a few at us. We're also thankful for all the audience members who've stayed along with us. I know it's been 3 hours of panel discussions almost, so completely understand. I've also been informed that a lot of you are viewing on Facebook, so thank you for joining us on Facebook as well. Uh, to Himaki's point, maybe the situation is not all that grim, and maybe it's just little behavioral nudges and changes that can change the whole situation. One thing that I wanted to talk about, and which I have briefly discussed in one of my classes at GPODS as well, but how does the whole population ethics problem figure into wildlife? Why I say that, let me make it clear, is that eventually it's a dispute over habitat. It all boils down to humanity taking more and more land, the land that is already available. So there's obviously poaching that happens for financial purposes, but there's a lot of killing that happens because a stray leopard ventures into a village. Or it happened in the national capital region of Delhi recently, where a leopard came into one of the established colonies. And when they do come in, there's obviously there is killing that happens, and ultimately it all boils down to the habitat loss of those wildlife species. And how it is reported in the news is also telling of what we as humans perceive ourselves to be, which is a snow leopard strays into human habitation, which was never the case. Where does that figure in the general conversation that we're having about wildlife preservation, habitat loss, uh, maybe having a policy that adds a few hectares every year to national reserves and wildlife sanctuaries? What are the ways out when it comes to habitat preservation? I know this is a bit of a curveball and we've not really had a discussion on this, but I think a good discussion is one where you can come up with new points while you're having that discussion.
I have a thought. I think we are adding, more area to our conservation areas and forest areas. Just on a happy note, Maharashtra recently declared 8 or 10 areas for as conservation reserves. Okay. Um,
For our
another
audiences, Maharashtra is a state in
in
India.
India, in India. Another point is, I think you also mentioned giving rights to communities, incentivizing them to protect habitats and conserve. I think community rights is also a way to go to preserve and protect our habitats.
There's also an argument in some scholarship over the past couple of decades where animal rights should be put at par with human rights. And uh, to the rights of community, you can add an angle of making guardianship or wardship of certain species of a certain area belonging to that of the community of that area. So you are actually responsible for the preservation of those wildlife species. And there are positive and negative impacts of both. So if you do something towards it, you're strengthening your right to life through those of rights to animals. And if you do not, then there's obviously some penalties, or you can come up with some punitive measures to disincentivize killing of wildlife animals there as well. But I think it's been a riveting discussion. Again, there are so many more things that we have left to discuss, but we have to adhere to the time, and we have about 15 minutes on the clock, and it was decided that that's where we will start with the conclusion. So I'll probably open it up for each of you one by one, and any thoughts that you might have about our discussion, anything you might want to add or anything you want to conclude with. You can be optimistic, pessimistic, name names, name drop, whichever way you wish to go about it. Uh, if you don't want to call it China virus, that's also fine. Even though this is recorded in live on Facebook, so yeah, you might want to be careful. But anyway, so let me start with Arundhati, who hasn't spoken for a bit.
I think it was a very interesting discussion, and how we started by talking that the whole pandemic situation has put a light on the good side of it, and we know that how in urban spaces, in many places around the world, the wildlife or the animals were taking a break and coming out of their comfort areas and going. So we were talking about the optimistic side of it, that for the wildlife or for the nature, probably this is a good period finally. But also, since we touched upon the whole issue of the wet markets and the poaching, I think that we need to take steps, and we need to take them soon, because as more people unfortunately lost their jobs due to the whole pandemic situations, and as they were going back to the rural areas, it's going to put on more pressure on the natural resources. And if we don't take steps accordingly, be it the technological solutions or the policy solutions, we could be in a bigger mess right now, because as we also mentioned, the anthropocentric approach, and for the good or bad, like humans are very much human centric. I don't know how soon would at least the 1.3 or whatever billion population, sorry, that's the Indian population, 7 billion and counting population is going to, really learn something so soon. So yeah.
Interesting point. I think Ria, you had mentioned that some statistic about wildlife trade during the lockdown. It rose up by a certain percentage.
Poaching in India, according to traffic, the particular institution that deals with wildlife trafficking in India, released a report that said that it's 151% of usual poaching numbers during the lockdown.
So yeah, it's not all good. I mean, we started with the assumption that nature is healing hashtag, but that's not really the case, at least in terms of wildlife. Uh, anyway, going ahead with our statements to conclude. Let's go ahead with Ria, since you're already discussing that, Ria.
Sure. So I think my overall takeaway, what I would start with is that nature has a huge capacity for regeneration if we allow it. If we look at these issues as macro issues, if we go down to the actual roots of these issues that are coming up, it is basically the way that we've aligned our systems in our societies. I feel like if we look at the certain movements such as the degrowth movement within businesses, and if we look at realigning business incentives and the way we structured our society and aligned our incentives in society, that is the way to actual change. Looking at maybe like the 6 capitals framework for businesses, for example, where they're actually taking into account the impact that they have on natural capital and social capital. That is actually the way that we could probably solve these issues in the long run. But in the short term, I would say that at least we have to look into captivity wherever we have animals in captivity, and look at improving those conditions, building legal mandates for that, making systems where we have those checks and balances in place to prevent further issues this way, like this.
I mean, really good point there. The way to promote this going forward, and just to add to and develop your point further, a recent trend, at least globally, in response to climate change, has been the setting up of carbon sinks and corporate funded sequestration projects, and national consequence of having a preserved forest that is now being preserved on the money of a particular corporate, or maybe through reputational risks of whatever, would be the preservation of habitat of such wildlife that resides there as well. So that's also a positive consequence going forward. Also, just to go back to the pandemic and COVID-19 angle of our discussion, which is where we started, before I move on to Shivangi, we must also realize that it's an aging population, the world population. I know that India is 28 years and Pakistan is 24 years, but we're just blips in the usual trend. If you look at Scandinavia, Japan, these are populations that are well into their 60s as when it comes to their average age. So a consequence, natural consequence of every pandemic is that it affects the aging population a lot more, or comorbidity, people who have comorbidity a lot more. So as we age as global populace, the effects of any pandemic would be more detrimental as we go on. And that is why, even if we have to take an anthropocentric approach to change our behaviors and somehow control legal and illegal wildlife trade, we probably have to, because the next time COVID-19, COVID-21 or 23 might just spell a bit more doom for humanity in terms of deaths when it comes to aging population. Shivangi, on that positive note, you had something to say?
That wasn't positive at all, Ishan.
Yeah.
Before I move on, I just thought that, okay, that's going to be our karma. But since we all love our discussions on morality, I like what Ria said, and I am completely, she explained it very well. I think businesses are also becoming more responsible, connecting back to the pandemics. a lot of brands are turning vegan, so that reduces, say, experimentation on the smaller animals, as we discussed. Um, I think there's a lot of hope, and we are having so many discussions. I'm sure at least two of us will, take this forward and do something about it. So this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shivangi. Himaki, over to you.
Um, so, with a positive note, after every lull, after every low, there's always a high. After the SARS, there was a change in the economy of Japan and China. After the 2008 recession, there was a huge boost to the start of the economy. So after this COVID, I think we all have learned from our mistakes. And I think one thing which made us realize was that because there was this sudden pause, right? It's called the anthropause, where human activities had stopped. And then suddenly there was like a boom in the wildlife going and interacting with the human nature. So how animals and human have a very complicated relation, and this has kind of opened new avenues for scientists and research developers to study, this interaction between the animals into this urban locality and normal locality, and how it has affected, how it's going to be into the new world, how they're going to be, maybe there'll be more zoonotic diseases, but how we can mitigate them in the coming years. So I think it has opened more like new avenues to scientific domains as well, and on how we study this complex relationship. Because all this while we were seeing them, like it was very observational, but I think now it goes into we delve deeper into it. So I think that could be one of the positive notes as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Himaki. I like the fact that all of us have tried to put a positive spin on this, and all of you have succeeded very well in doing so. Also, I've never heard of the term anthropause. I don't know if I'm just off Twitter, that's why I haven't heard of it, but it's a cool term. I should be, and I think all of us should be using it a little more. So again, let me thank each of the audience members. I know it's been a grueling 3 hours, and all of those listening in on Zoom and on Facebook, and who will be listening to the recording of this thing. So thank you so much for attending. I hope it was a riveting discussion. Please do reach out to each of our fellows if you have any doubts. You have their names. They will be available on LinkedIn, even Arundhati. And also, please carry the conversation forward. Let us make sure that the conversation has just begun about wildlife conservation and its snowballing effect on the pandemic and public health crisis that has ensued over the past 1 year or so. So let's carry the conversation forward. As I mentioned, this is only day one of the GPODS Ideation Summit, or if you will, International Ideation Summit, which is quite a mouthful. And we'd be back again at 7:30 p.m. IST tomorrow for a couple of very interesting topics, including space policy, including waste management, and a bunch of others. So I look forward to having all of you tomorrow and meeting all of you tomorrow. Until then, a big thank you to all the audience members. And again, a very, very big thank you to Arundhati, Himaki, Ria, and Shivangi for joining us. I'm sure the conversations will continue. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ishan.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ishma. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.